All right, hi everyone, and welcome to IndieBio's Fundamental Questions of Biotech, where we gather thought leaders and founders in particular sectors and ask the questions that are on our minds to move these technologies into the future. Today, we are going to focus on fashion and the fashion industry and some of the biotechnologies that are necessary in order to create a more sustainable world. But before I introduce you to today's panelists, let me introduce you to this little corner of the internet that we have built out for our space. We hope that the extra bells and whistles make it a more enjoyable experience for you, our audience. As you scroll down, you will see the bios of the panelists here today, as well as links related to some of the things that we are going to talk about. You will also see a couple of buttons if you are yourself an early stage founder and interested in joining IndieBio. You can click that button and apply. It's about a 10-minute process. We don't ask for we want to make it as painless as possible. And there's also a button if you're interested in learning about additional ways that you can join the IndieBio community through events such as this. We have an events-specific newsletter, and you can sign up for that using that button down below. My name is Julie. I am part of the new IndieBio team here in our office in New York. Speaking to you from New York, as are some of our panelists today. And I'm very pleased to introduce a number of colleagues here who are working on very, very pressing problems. And we are going to talk about how they will use their expertise to design the life cycle of biomaterials. So I'd like to introduce first Amy Congdon, the head of design intelligence at Biofabricate. Welcome, Amy. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Julie. Great to be here.
Yes, it's great to have you. I would like to introduce Erin, CEO and co-founder of Alginate.
Excited to be here.
Thank you, Erin, for taking time to spend with us today. And I'd like to introduce Alex Greenhalgh, the CEO and co-founder of SpinRets. Alex, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Julie. Looking forward to this conversation.
As am I, and Alex does get a special hat tip, as I said offline, because he's calling in all the way from England, where it is a much later than the happy hour time that we have planned for those of you in the Eastern time zone. So thank you, Alex, for staying up to make it a super late happy hour.
No problem.
So the problem of materials is one that may not be familiar with all of our audience. I'm not sure that everyone understands where we're coming from. And I think it's important to lay the foundation of some of the more pressing problems, not just around biomaterials, but maybe around the fashion industry before we even begin with the technologies that we want to talk about that are represented here today. And so what I'd like to do, oh gosh, you know what I forgot was to ask you guys to introduce yourselves and your companies. I'm so sorry. I told you I was off my game because it's been a couple of weeks. I would like to lay the foundation and talk about the problems. But first, I would like you guys to introduce yourselves so that you can talk a little bit about your background as it relates to today's conversation and to the greater biomaterials infrastructure. And then, of course, we will jump into the actual conversation. So we'll go in the exact same order that I said hello to. I'll start with you, Amy.
Thanks, Julie. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Amy. My background is I'm a designer and I studied textiles. But my PhD was actually in tissue engineered textiles, and that was at Central St Martin's in London, but done in collaboration with King's College London at the Biomaterials and Biophotonics department based at Guy's Hospital. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, that one. I always have to make sure I get it out. And then, so that research was looking at controlling and orienting cell growth on different textile scaffolds and structures. And most recently, I was Associate Director of Materials Design at Modern Meadow here in New York, and I'm now full-time Head of Design Intelligence at Biofabricate, also in New York. And Biofabricate, we work with biomaterial innovators, brands, and investors, and we do that through consulting, events, reports, and our vision is a sustainable material world built with biology and not oil.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy. And, you know, because we're at the front of the program and I want everyone to know that there are opportunities to interact with Biofabricate coming forward, could you just let everyone know that there's something coming up that they can sign up for?
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, that's great. So we have been co-authoring a report with Fashion for Good based in the Netherlands, and it is a report on biomaterials for the fashion and textile industry. So everything from definitions to process diagrams around how these materials are made, some of the issues around scaling them up and what it takes to bring them to market. So really it's a primer for the industry just to sort of, lay the groundwork for that. So we've got an event happening on the 7th of December, which will launch the report, and it's going to be freely available to download, and we hope it sort of it stands as a sort of a point to bring everyone together and to really push the conversation forwards on these incredible materials and technologies. So we'd love everyone to join us on the 7th.
Well, I'm certainly planning on joining, and we could consider today maybe a little primer or a preview of what's to come. So wonderful. Next, Erin, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and your company and what it is you do within the biomaterials space, please.
Absolutely. So yeah, hey guys, my name is Erin. I started with a background in biology, and then eventually moved into design after working in the composting and textile recycling industry here in New York, which just gave me massive insight on how the industry works, and saw some of the issues with it, and really wanted to solve it. I started trying to solve that in design and realized that really the critical issues lie in the material world, and that's why my co-founders and I founded AlgaeNet. We're looking at the fashion industry, which is one of the most polluting industries on Earth, and we were all sort of like working in a similar space in design, and weren't really prepared to go into one of the most polluting industries on Earth and contribute to that. So we wanted to make something that would enable us and other designers to do something better, to, when they're making a material decision, make the good decision. And so we do that with textiles. We make a textile fiber, which is the building block of textiles and garments. And to do it, we use a material that comes from a seaweed called kelp, which is one of the fastest growing organisms on Earth. So we do sustainability sort of at every stage of the production and use and degradation, and really want to make a material that no matter where it ends up, it's okay.
And when you say ends up, you're talking about that end of life that we'll be speaking about, right?
When it,
so no matter
when it
what
goes
happens,
away.
when it goes away, when you're done with that material. I like it.
Exactly.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Excellent introduction. And finally, Alex, if you would please introduce your background, give a little bit of your training and your relatively new company, I think as the part of the most recent IndieBio batch, perhaps the youngest company here.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, my name's Alex. My background is also in biology, and the last several years, actually far longer than I can remember half the time, I've been working in silk research at the University of Oxford as part of the research group there. I come at this, I guess, from a slightly different angle, being less involved in the kind of design, understanding aspects of the kind of later stage products, but really more coming from the material beginning and how you produce the material. And this is very much in line with what we are doing at Spintex, where we are using a slightly different and novel nature-inspired approach to produce our fibers. So we took inspiration from what is possibly the most energy efficient way to produce a textile that is protein-based, what we see in the spider, and we really try to understand that processing, what is unique about the way that a spider spins its fiber that allows it to produce not only a highly energy efficient material, but a very high performance, high quality material that is also very high quality in its feel and in its look. And if we could reproduce it en masse, would have applications beyond even the kind of clothing textiles, but in more advanced material applications. And what we've done is replicated the spinning process that we start off from an active feedstock that responds to a physical force. So you can produce a fiber purely by pulling from a liquid solution. And when we compare this to, say, comparable plastic, it's about 1,000 times more energy efficient to produce a fiber through this bio-inspired route than a process that involves inputting heat or high pressures or toxic solvents. And as we produce also a protein-based fiber, again, we're looking towards that kind of end of life aspect of our material, and having something that when eventually it does break down is not adding in any form contaminants or bioaccumulating within nature.
Very, very interesting. I'll admit, in my research for this conversation today, I went into this deep dive on spider spinnerets, and I wonder if you take inspiration from the actual physical way that spiders are spinning that, or if you use something that kind of mimics it in a different sense.
I mean, yeah, a little bit fundamentally, because what's really critical is it's a pulling, not a pushing. And this is, I mean, if a spider was trying to actually push out the fiber, the forces that would be required would be enough to explode the spider. So when you've got a kind of highly viscous material inside of an animal, it just can't force it out. So it really is this pulling, and it's such a unique and creative way to produce a fiber where you just pull, and it's the pulling that provides the energy for self-assembly. You have a material that wants to become a fiber, it just needs to be guided in the right direction, and you can do that by pulling. So that aspect of it, we are very fundamentally inspired by.
Oh, it's very, very interesting. All right, now let's get back to the fundamentals that I had kind of jumped the gun on, so that we can talk about the problems that you're solving by creating these novel materials. And here I'm going to turn to Amy, because I think this is something that you guys think about on a high level quite often, right? Like what are some of the challenges that the fashion industry is facing? And I'd like to talk about this, of course, in the sense of pollution, as Erin has already mentioned, but also just what does that mean for the growth of the industry going forward? So can you maybe start us off with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's I think the fashion industry obviously has woken up to the sustainability issue that it has, and that's across its supply chain, everything from the sourcing of raw materials to where they're manufactured, and then of course end of life, and that how all that fits together is incredibly complex. So they're definitely looking for new materials that are more sustainable, but they're also looking at their own sort of supply chains to figure out what that is. So and that's an incredibly complex process to do. You know, when you're looking at something like an LCA, how do you track all the different inputs that go into your supply chain, and then how do you sort of make sure that you are using the most sustainable thing that you can? I think it's not just about pollution, it's about the energy that's used, the water, whether you can recycle it and bring it back into a closed loop, whether it can biodegrade. If it can biodegrade, is that in what conditions? So it's incredibly complex across all those different sort of aspects of a material and a product's lifespan. So there's definitely this look to this new generation of materials to see if are they better in that regard? Can they have a better sustainability story? We find that a lot of brands are asking, just want that simple answer, like what's better? And that's seems like a very simple question to ask, but it's always a very complicated answer, which is not always what people want to hear. You know, it depends on so many different things. But, you know, as everyone knows, you know, it's imperative. I think we've got this next decade to really sort everything. We're trying to get ourselves on a track that will sort things out, because we are going to get past a point of sort of no return in regards to the climate. So I think everyone's very aware on that deadline. But just, and it's going to take all number of innovations and materials and even system change to make sure that we can get there. There's not going to be that one silver bullet that fixes everything. We have to look across all different types of innovation and technology to try and get us there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like that question of what's better. I think we'll revisit that. So I'm going to put a pin in that, but that's a great place to segue later on. Now, I'd like to maybe also touch on something else that Amy said, which is that it's not just pollution, because I think often this statistic of the fashion industry being the second most polluting industry is something that is cited over and over again as an impetus for some of these new biomaterials or new materials that are more sustainable, regardless of how they're made. And it's not just the waste that goes out, but also the energy that goes in. And I think, although I'm not sure, that this is where Spintex really comes into play, because when you think about the natural fibers of silk, you don't necessarily necessarily think, oh, this is a problem in terms of degradation or really lasting forever the way that some of those oil-based compounds are. But there's still a larger ecological footprint than many people, including myself, might realize. So Alex, could you maybe shed a little bit of light on how even natural materials can have a larger footprint than we realize?
Yeah, no, I think this is a really good point actually, because this also ties in with how plastics are seen at the moment as well. Um, I think the kind of energy embodiment that goes into a material is one aspect that we need to definitely focus on, particularly in how that material is used. It's the kind of classic conundrum between the glass bottles and the plastic bottles. Yes, you can recycle and reuse the glass bottles, but they're heavier, they're bulkier, they then use more of their CO2 credits, so to speak, as they're transported, they get broken. It's as Amy was saying, it's always more complicated than it would first appear. And when we look at silk, for example, this is a material that has been a traditional material for thousands of years. It's one of really one of the kind of oldest industries to come out of Asia. And traditionally, this was a material that would actually have had a lower impact. But as it's become mechanized and industrialized, and the processes have gone towards producing as much of it as possible for as cheap as possible, this is where we started to really see the kind of impact from effectively the majority of it coming from the energy consumption. So traditional silks that come from the silkworm will spin a cocoon around itself. It's a really fascinating example of a kind of 3D printing. And that cocoon is all one long fiber, anything up to about 1 kilometer in length. And this will be pulled from the cocoon when the cocoons are in massive boiling vats of water, normally with some other chemicals in there to soften this kind of gluey sericin protein that surrounds the cocoon. And traditionally, this would have been done using wood fuel, but now more increasingly in the industrial context, you're using heating elements which are electrical powered. So you have this loss of efficiency from the electricity being turned to heat. And quite often, because the vast majority of silk is still sourced from China, the vast majority of that energy is still coming from coal or shale oil. And this is where we really see the CO2 impact of traditional silk. So even though the material itself will biodegrade, it's protein, it's a renewable resource, it's natural, it ticks so many of these boxes, it's the processing and the kind of energy requirements of that processing that are really the things that make it have an impact.
And in choosing your material that you were going to create, you didn't go with that silkworm. You decided to make something very similar. And can you talk a little bit about how it was that you chose to basically replace one material with one that one could argue is even better?
Yeah, I think for us, it was very much looking at the processing and how do you produce the fiber. So traditionally, you would allow the animal to produce the material and then you would harvest it in the same way that you would maybe do with wool, or you allow cotton to grow and you harvest that. And I
Mhm.
think we wanted to go a step back from that and say, what if we could control that spinning process? What if we could produce the fiber we want on demand and actually remove a lot of this processing that we see that has this high energy requirement? Because when the silkworm or when the spider is making the fiber, it is incredibly energy efficient. It's the harvesting of that material after the fact that has the input. So if you can produce the fiber using a similar processing, having that kind of bio-inspired approach, then you can completely remove all of that high energy impact that you get from the harvesting stage.
Very, very interesting. And I believe that you're able to produce the protein even without bioreactors, if I recall correctly, which is another great technology, very useful in replacing many different types of production, but is also very high energy input, correct?
Yeah, so we don't use a fermentation approach to produce our protein. And this does mean that we avoid a lot of that kind of energy requirement that we do see with bioreactors. Depending on the type of bioreactor, it can be running consistently at 37 degrees. You also have to think about what are the consumables that go into that bioreactor.
Mm.
If you are growing E. coli, quite often you're having to feed in sugars. Where are the sugars coming from? Are they coming from uh, arable land that would normally be producing food crops. There's a human factor that then comes into play there. When we also look at bioreactors, there can be a huge amount of water usage. There's the protein purification steps. Within some methodologies, I believe there's also dehydration once the protein is extracted, normally by freeze drying, which is again a very energy intensive process. So whenever we kind of approach new materials, I always feel that we need to have a look at the processing and kind of understand actually what is the input of that process to the overall materials impact. You can't just focus on one aspect. There are going to be many other aspects, and I think that's something all of us, I know for us, it's something that we definitely want to do more work on and actually have more data to really be certain that every step of our process is as good as it can be.
Yeah, well, every step, as Amy said, is going to need to be addressed in order to make a more sustainable world. So excellent summary. Thank you, Alex. Now, the products that you are making at Alginate, Erin, you mentioned fibers that you hope will be the building blocks of many different materials. So could you talk a little bit about these, because it's not replacing something that people might be familiar with in the same sense of making another type of silk that, you know, is something that is tangible and we're maybe a little more familiar with.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what we're talking about is the textile fiber, which is the building block.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's, you know, when it's pretty interesting because, you know, 100 years ago, every textile was made out of fiber. And what a fiber is, it's like this short little, it'll often be called a staple fiber, but it's a staple length. It's called, you know, a few inches, or, you know, 9 centimeters. And if you can imagine, if you've got a sheep that you're shearing,
exactly,
that's, you know, it's like you're cutting your hair. You get what is essentially a fiber of a certain length. What we're able to do now, I mean, with any sort of man-made fiber, is create what's called a filament, which is this long, continuous, if, you know, fiber is not the right word, but you could say a long continuous fiber, which is a filament. And so that's the upside to that, is that it gives us a exceptional level of control. It's not dependent on, you know, when we shear the sheep or how long the cotton growing season is. We can make it with an incredible level of control.
And so would that mean, let's say you wanted something that had a certain strength, right? A certain like springiness or tensile strength. Would you be able to design that into maybe the length of the fiber, or with a composite, add in something in addition to that kelp baseline that you're using?
I would say that's the special sauce.
All right. Excellent. Yep. I'm glad I was able to figure it out. Actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking like a fiber, and this might be way off and like some kind of wacky, like after hours type of analogy, but if the fibers are like your forearms, you're kind of like wrapping them into a filament, right? To make them longer. And it's just a bunch of arms that are kind of wrapped long, right? Along those lines.
That would be wrapping them into the yarn. So that's like
that's spinning. The yarn. Oh, okay.
When you talk about spinning, that's like, you know, you've got one fiber here and one fiber there, and kind of, you know.
I see. Yeah. Okay, very
and
interesting.
So you can, you can really go down a deep hole of vocabulary.
But what you did mention is that you're able to change those different properties. And I kind of want to pull this back to what Amy had said before about being better, right? There was actually just a press release today for another company in biomaterials, MycoWorks. I'm not sure if you guys saw that, but it was an announcement of a fundraise, which is wonderful. And the CEO, Matthew Scullin, said something that really struck me. And it was, there's this, I'm just going to quote here. I actually have it written down. There's a misconception that brands are willing to sacrifice performance for sustainability, and that's not true. The real adoption occurs in an industry like this when the performance is there. And so I guess I'm just going to first throw it to you, Amy, and say, is that a statement that resonates with you when you think of better? What is this starting to encapsulate what better means? Not just like, oh, good, it's better for the earth, but also it's going to be something that people will want to use, right?
Absolutely. I think there's something which people think you can sort of have one aspect and that's fine if it is just more sustainable. Of course, that's a huge part of it, but also there is something we would almost call like table stakes. Like it has to perform in the application which you want to use it, because otherwise brands have, relationships with their customers where they're expecting like a shoe to stay on their foot and not for the top to blow out when you're like running off.
I do expect my shoes to stay on my feet.
You do.
That's a true statement.
It's a good thing to have a shoe do, like, or that the bottom not to fall out of your bag or things like that. So
exactly,
something where it's table stakes. I mean, one thing I will say is that we are asking an awful lot of these new materials because we're asking them to perform in the same way, be more sustainable, ideally be the same price or cheaper, and then ideally even outperform what's currently there. And that's an awful lot to ask of like a first generation material. So I think there is a really important conversation to have around where are the areas that we might look to compromise or think, okay, can we have everything in that first generation? Because that's an awful lot to ask. We're also asking it of innovators who are small startup teams where traditionally those types of new material innovations were coming out of the likes of DuPont and Dow and BASF or the military, which have a much bigger budget, team,
more bandwidth.
Exactly. So that's a lot to put onto small teams. I think we have to just be aware that all these things take time and you're not going to get everything in the first generation, but almost the first thing that comes out, it's just going to get better as those generations sort of progress. But I think that the idea of like what's better, and that's also for brands to say like what's the most important thing for them. But I think sustainability, it has to be more sustainable. We can't make the next plastic because we don't want to get 10 years down the line and realize that we've done that. So I think we have to do all of this, and there's lots of really great potential benefits of biomaterials. We have to do all development with our eyes wide open and be really, like Erin saying, like, and Alex, so we're like really tracking all of that data and making sure we know what we're comparing against, where it needs to do better, maybe where are some of the areas where it doesn't, so we need to put more focus on, but just have to really do that in the most cohesive and sort of expansive way possible.
Yeah, well, oh, go ahead.
If
Erin,
I could
please
add like one more point onto that, I think this is part of why fashion is such a great space to work. Is when you think about some of the really high performing synthetics, the tensile strength of like nylon or polyester, it is way beyond what we need to make clothing out of.
Yeah, right.
And so if we dial that back a little bit, we'll be okay.
Yeah.
It's like it's not a significant change in performance, even if it's not like surpassing some of these first generation super materials from these companies like DuPont.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. And it might actually answer my question that I was going to pose to Amy as a follow-up, which is, where is that compromise? What are the areas that you can say, okay, well, it's more important that we focus on X and Y is where we can let things slip a little bit. And I'm going to guess that you might also say something along the same lines that Erin just said, but perhaps disagree with me. Feel free to disagree with me.
No, absolutely. It's on the money. Like we are great, and we have become fantastic, especially in synthetic materials, at developing the most incredible high performing materials. Look at the fact we're using things which will, definitely outperforming what we need them to in certain applications. So I think there is some amount of, okay, there's a table stakes of performance that you need to get so that you can manufacture into a product that it's going to last the amount of time that you need. So I definitely think there's that, but how far do you need to go beyond that is definitely something that I think brands could really think about. But also, and it's the one that people don't want to hear, is price. What we're probably going to have to compromise on is that all new technologies are more expensive because they have not achieved the economies of scale of the synthetics, or even things like cotton, which have had 50, 80, a long time to get to the kind of scale and ubiquity that they've got. So that's something also to realize, is that these materials will come down in price, but they are going to be more expensive. And like, what's your tolerance in the short term, the medium, and then where do you need it to get to? I think that's also the point. Everyone needs to be very transparent about what they can tolerate, but also know that it's a real big ask to ask these materials to come anywhere near to the types of prices that we're seeing with some of the commodity fibers and textiles that we're currently using.
Yeah, absolutely. And I imagine Alex and Erin, as entrepreneurs, that when you're going out and speaking with customers, they're asking about certain parts of the conversation, parts of that lifeline that help you to know what is going to be important in order to get the material to market. So I can see that you're nodding there, Alex. So I'm going to turn to you first. So I'm guessing you've got something top of mind here.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely as Amy said. Price always comes up at some point in any conversation you're having, um, and I think definitely you have to go into that with some honesty about where you are at that point and where you could conceivably be when those economies of scale kick in. There's no point promising that it's going to be, at a ridiculous low price in 6 months or 1 year when you know it's going to take longer than that. I guess when you look at pricing, it's exactly as Amy said as well, there is a need for what is the market actually going to take as the kind of price points for garments. We've obviously seen a shift in recent years towards cheaper and cheaper clothing. So the expectation for the price of clothing has been set at a far lower level than it would have been maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago. But then the expectation for how long that garment will last has also changed. We've seen the kind of rise of fast fashion. We've seen kind of changing lines more and more frequently. And again, when I think about something like silk traditionally, that all that energy and all that kind of sustainability issue in its manufacture would normally have been offset by the longevity of the material. This is material that could last for hundreds of years potentially if it
Easily,
was
yeah.
cared for. And this is true also for a lot of other materials which have somewhat fallen out of favor. Wool, for example, is a material that has a bit of a bad reputation these days in terms of its environmental impact compared to some other materials. But it can be a very long-lasting material, and when it's included in a jumper or a piece of clothing that you will have for 15, 20 years, then that impact starts to look a little bit different. Um, so it's again a complicated answer to any of the questions in this discussion because there are so many different chains that are connected, and so much of it is dependent on what the people actually wearing the clothes are going to be happy with and what they want to do and what they want to see. Um, but I do feel that something that does give me a bit of hope at the moment is that you do see this consumer push for better materials, for better standards of traceability, workforce, labor rights, sustainability, end of life. So I think all the trends are there. It's just potentially for some of the smaller companies just starting out on the kind of biomaterial journey, the support also has to be there from those who are more established. And I think that is also getting better as well. But
Well,
it's a very important aspect of the long process it takes to make new materials become standard.
yeah, absolutely. And I would guess that organizations like Biofabricate can help to provide that support to some of the companies as they need it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the reasons why we wanted to also write the report, but just seeing that there are so many sort of common problems that happen, and how do we support this new generation of materials, because it's hugely complex, and the levels of technology that are being developed, it's almost like 5 different companies in one. Sometimes you have everything from cell engineers to fermentation experts maybe, or people who are looking at downstream processing or material science, and you have to get all of those things in a line, and then also having all those relationships in place. It's incredibly complex, and it's really time consuming. It's much more involved than some of the other materials, sort of things like the sort of fruit sort of leathers that we've seen come out, where it's like a mix of perhaps an agricultural crop waste or something like that. There's a level of complexity that's really takes time to develop when you're working with sort of living organisms and all of the different technology that is involved with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Erin, I don't want to pass over you. I also saw you kind of nodding when I was mentioning like customer discussions in terms of certain properties that people are looking at. Given your ability to engineer various properties, are there some that they look for in terms of the actual like material itself, in addition to things like price?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's like performance and price. We talked about performance, and it's really, we got to match the performance that is asked of us. Like exceeding it's great, matching it works too. But just the feel of it, the material is hugely important. Is it comfortable? Does it feel good when you touch it? Like when it's on the rack? It's like, we talk so often about performance, like, how strong is it? How abrasion resistant is it? But there, to a consumer, sizing up a piece of clothing, that's not a huge consideration. It's, does this feel good? Do I want to wear it?
Yeah, when you go through the store and you feel the things and
Yeah.
you get the tactile interaction. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I could.
So I think it's like it's easy to get sort of like sucked into the really sort of technical performance, and you forget that, you know, these, you know, the garments that so many of us wear are these like really designed products. They're not so much engineered.
Right. That's a nice distinction there.
It's definitely true. I think you can meet one of the things we will say, you can meet all of the technical specs and you can still put it in the hands of a designer and they go, but I don't like it, or it's not soft, or I know I know it reaches the read for soft on your softest meter, but it's not soft to me. Right. So, you know, like the sort of qualitative and quantitative sort of aspects of data, and how do you bring those two together? Because you can hit every single performance characteristics, like you're saying, Erin, but like how does it perform? Because I think consumers assume that if it's made into a garment, it's going to do what it needs to do. Like you're not even thinking about the performance because you just expect it to be there. It's then like, do I like what it looks like, how it feels? But all of those are so important to bring into the mix. You can't sort of back end that stuff in. You have to make sure that you're thinking about all of those things. And there's so many different aspects to sort of keep in mind as you're developing a material. So
yeah. Will people want it at the end is probably a big consideration. I'm sure that all the folks that Alex and Erin are speaking with and that you speak with as well, Amy, are definitely taking that into consideration as well.
Totally. And that's why we have designers on the team.
Of course. Now, I want to bring it, we've talked a little bit about the impetus to make these materials and how you can iterate on them. But of course, we want to focus on the entire life cycle. And here, Erin had mentioned right at the beginning, you know, we want something that no matter where it ends up will be safe. And I kind of struggle in this area because these are new materials. And so it seems without having that historical record of like, oh, I've had a cotton shirt and I know that it degrades after this long. How do you know what the life cycle even is, and let alone like where it's going to end up? So I guess I'll turn it first to you, Erin, since you did bring this up at the beginning. But
totally,
how do you know how long a fiber or a garment, I guess I should say, because that's how we're truly interacting with it at this stage. It's been worn, hopefully loved for a long time, and then ends up somewhere else, right? So how do you know how long that lifetime is?
Certainly. I mean, the one of the cool things about working with a material that, you know, has been around for, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of millions of years, you know, is that people have looked at this already. You know, we're creating something new, but it is not made out of, you know, novel materials itself. Like the molecules have been around for a while, and we know that there are, you know, organisms in the ocean, in the soil, in a compost pile, and, you know, an anaerobic digester that can break down the materials, and even, you know, looking at some of the sort of like chemical derivatives, that it's very clear from the existing body of research that this can go away in the right environment very quickly.
And by go away, you mean become some sort of natural,
right.
I
like the
term
term
I want to say, what do you mean
biodigested? That it's like biodigested. So at a you know, which is just a fancy word for digested. You know, that it's like it can be consumed, converted into calories, you know, go through the same metabolism as you know, another like food particle would go to.
Okay, sure, that makes sense. So that
that's right, and because especially with you know, with textiles, because, you know, we know that, you know, about 1/3 of the microplastics in our oceans come from fashion, come from garments, come from textiles. And that's something that's happening while they're being worn, while they're being washed. It's sort of like this, you know, explosion of little tiny particles that it's, you know, really difficult to control. And so this idea that we can sort of capture all of the plastic that gets produced and recycle it is like pretty out there to me. And so our thought is, you know, we need to make sure that no matter where this ends up, you know, no matter what sort of organism encounters it, you know, it's not going to poison, it's not going to hurt the organism.
Right. So those tiny little, I guess they'd be like the fibers that you were talking about in the beginning. As they leave the garment, perhaps they will be encountered in the small form, or as the garment as itself, right, as an entire
totally
sheet of fabric now. Oh, very interesting.
Yeah.
And I
Gotta
wanted
take care of the plankton.
to take care of the plankton,
They're
the plankton
important.
and yeah, all the things
Yeah.
that the plankton eat, right? Yeah.
Yep.
So because we talked a little bit about the characteristics that consumers might want, let's say durability, or you could even say like waterproofness or something along those lines. How does that impact or affect the end of life in terms of where you see alginate polymers ending up, or whether they are chemically compatible with some of those microorganisms, or whether, let's say, Spintex makes let's say a protein variant that might not be recognized by some of the microbes that are, the natural degraders of the world, fungi or bacteria or whatever you want to imagine is going to eat up those. Do you struggle, I guess, what are the challenges in terms of finding ways to modify the materials in a way that keeps them sustainable in the true word of that closed loop sustainable material?
Totally. And that's absolutely essential. And it's challenging in a way to look at the existing ecosystem and say that we're only changing one piece of it, but there's other points in the ecosystem that are also far from ideal. So right. There's the I think often in the sustainability discussion there's this argument that if it can't be perfect, it's not worth doing. And because it's like we think of folks working in dyeing and finishing, doing really amazing work. They're at a similar stage as us, and we might not all get there at the exact same time to make the first perfect thing on day one. We've got to work with the ecosystem that we're in, and with so many companies at different stages creating these building blocks for a truly sustainable fiber, we're definitely going to get there.
And that, I assume, would include companies that are creating novel ways to treat some of the materials that you guys are generating. Do you have thoughts on that, Alex, in terms of the proteins that you are creating, which, protein, that's a natural thing. Many different organisms can recognize those and use them for nutrients. How do you consider that as you either iterate on the protein or treat the Spintex fibers themselves?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow on what Erin said there, because I think it's a really important point. There doesn't have to solve issues in textiles and sustainability. We don't just use one material in textiles at the moment anyway. There's going to be multiple different materials that we will need that will have different facets of their properties, of their end of life, of their use case, that is going to make them relevant to solving sustainability issues. So I think that's a really important point. We don't need one wonder material that will solve every single problem. It's always going to be multifaceted. So I think from our perspective, quite often what we're looking at is very specifically in the first instance around the kind of traditional silks and what do they need to do? What does our fiber need to do to kind of exist within that space? So the performance characteristics are important, and the kind of end of life properties of that material will come from how you get that performance. So we do know that silks traditionally can be very long living in the environment, but they can also break down very quickly given the right impetus. So the kind of anaerobic digestion, that will definitely take care of it. It's still a protein. It will go through that process quite happily. Spiders quite often will recycle their own webs. They'll break down the web, consume it, and then use that protein source to then spin new webs. So we know there's the enzymatic routes to kind of breaking down a fiber back into a soup. And we've also explored the kind of end of life question as well, with can we return our fibers back into a more liquid state like we start, and then respin them into new fibers with similar properties. And then you're looking at it more from a kind of recycling perspective as well. But yeah, it's definitely something that we think about quite a lot. We've done some tests on. We know, similar to alginate, we can adjust the properties of our materials quite readily. So we have seen that we can adjust the breakdown of the material in certain environments depending on the parameters that we use to make the fiber. So without really adjusting the input, just by changing how we do our spinning, the different parameters that we put into the machinery, we can get a very different material in how it responds to processes for its end of life.
So
so it is
just to recapitulate or restate that to make sure I understand, just by changing the physics, basically, of what you're of how you're creating your fiber.
Yeah,
that's going to change its properties. Isn't that fascinating? Wow, that's
we can just press a button basically, and you can get different properties coming into the fiber. You can even have it as one fiber is being made. You could have different properties going into the fiber at different points. And this again, in how we know, even though it's somewhat of a new material, there is that kind of body of knowledge that you can draw upon to understand how things should act based on what you see. So when you look at the kind of structure of the material, you can say, oh, if it's got a little bit more of that, that will have that effect on its thermal decomposition. That will affect how it responds to enzymes. That will affect how it responds to a kind of corrosive chemical. So we're not completely in the dark. We do have kind of knowledge and experience to draw upon to kind of guide the direction that we follow.
Okay, very, very interesting. Now, to our audience, I apologize for not pointing this out ahead of time, but there is an area where you can add in questions if you have any for our panelists. And there is one here that I think will serve for like maybe our last topic because we are running short on time. But here, Cristiano asks, for brands in textiles, for new brands in textiles, does Biofabricate have a catalog of companies from where we can buy ready-to-use biomaterials? And I think what this might lead us into is the long lifespan of discovery that it takes before something gets to market. And so you can feel free to address the question directly, Amy, but also maybe talk a little bit about expectations for these materials to become available and to grow into basically a displacing type of technology that we hope will create a more sustainable world.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that we get asked a lot, and it's always one that I have to give a slightly disappointing answer to. In that, at the current moment, is that whilst it's great that so many of the materials that are imminently going to launch or on the market, their production is spoken for because there's such demand from brand partners to get them into their materials, but that's also because they're at limited scale. They're in the process of scaling up. So it does mean that there is a shortage of these materials, A, because they're still in development, or B, because they are already allocated because they're just not making the amount that we're used to. When you think about how much cotton we make a year, even in somewhere like the US or anywhere else, it's like hugely different in amount. So whilst we have a category of innovators, there's so many that just are not there yet or who will get there. I think it's one of the things that we spoke to previously is that these technologies do take time. And even when you've got something that works, you can make, a garment or a shoe or whatever it is that you're making, that you then have, there's also a process of getting enough material to service the demand. And the demand is so huge that that's a really, it's a good problem to have, but it's also a frustrating one when everyone wants to put it into their products now. So there are some that are slightly more mature. It's looking, I think, as Alex and Erin, everyone has said, that there's not going to be one solution. So it's looking across the board at all different sort of bio-based biomaterials. Biofabrication is, we definitely believe the future is sort of built with biology, but it takes time to scale those materials. A really good analogy is something like Lycra. So it took, I think, 10 years to develop that fiber, 3 years to commercialize it. So that's 13 years. And then think about, and that was 60 years ago. So how long it's taken for that fiber to have penetration in the market to the point where it's in sort of almost anything. So if you think about that with these types of technologies, that it's really deep technical science. There's a lot of sometimes when you're scaling up, you have to come up with a new way of scaling material because the technology or the process doesn't yet exist. And then you think about how it's going to fit into existing sort of manufacturing systems and all that. So it's all really complex, and it does take time. So there's a level of patience but support we need to give to these innovators as they bring them to market, because it's a marathon and not a sprint, definitely.
I love that saying. It is definitely a marathon. I would like to point people who are interested, if you're interested in consumer biotech, I don't think there's a lot of materials on the list at this moment, but my colleague at IndieBio San Francisco has made a website called madewithbiotech.com, and a number of different biotech created products which are available for purchase are there if you're looking for, let's say, a sustainable type of Christmas present. Anyways, that's an aside. I was just thinking that there is a place where you can find some of these things. But let's bring it back to the closed loop economy, which I think is really the focus of today's discussion. And I'd like to hear from all three of you in terms of who is really driving this, who's driving the innovation. Is it the scientists? And I'm going to give three options, and it might be none of those, right? We can feel free to just come up with like option 4. But in my mind, I'm thinking there's the scientists, the designers, the innovators who are making the new things. There's the companies who want to provide these sustainable materials and to add that brand value to the things that they are already selling. And then there's the consumers, those that are, with the purchase power can spend with their, vote with their wallet, right? In order to say, this is the type of thing that I want to see coming out and that I want to have in my closet. So among those three, or, choice D, whatever you think is actually driving this, where do you think the largest drive to make this entirely closed loop, like in the sense of finding some sort of natural material, turning it into something that we use, and then making sure that it has an end of life, a purposeful end of life that has been designed into that garment, is coming from? And I'm just going to kind of look around until I see someone nodding here.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting question. There's so many potential answers to your question. It's like, I think, overall, it's like we're asking this question because it's like society is pushing this. This is like part of the ethos. And I think one of the lesser appreciated forces in this is are the individuals that are, designing, manufacturing, the folks in the supply chain that want to see something and are open to something that is better. I can think of, if I'm a designer at a massive brand, producing, millions of polyester garments every year, I might, have a little part of me inside of me that, it's like, oh, I wish I could do something better. And so like there are, millions of people in these positions, like kind of like, I bet there's something better out there. And so I think there's huge power for the folks in those positions. And I think they're a real driver of change.
That's an excellent point, Erin, because I think that to many people who aren't in the industry, some of the environmental impact is hidden, right? It's not something that people even know that there is necessarily this impact.
Right. It's like if you want to like ask someone about waste, ask a garbage man, because they have very clear insight about what people throw away.
Yeah, and how much. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Alex or Amy, what are your thoughts in terms of drivers of innovation in this space?
I think it's actually, we're in a point where it's a bit of a perfect storm of, we have the technologies that are enabling these new innovations, like the dropping price of DNA synthesis. So the ability to read and write with the code of DNA to be able to create organisms at a cost that makes sense for consumer products is really important. So the technology is there to allow it. Then you have, the fashion industry waking up to the fact that it has a huge sustainability problem, and also consumers. So I think pressure from all sides. So it is it's a specific moment in time that is really allowing this to happen. I think one thing that we don't talk about enough probably is also the systems that are in place, and also the support that's needed to push this forward. We're talking about like garbage men and the systems that we have in place to deal with our rubbish and where things go. And you have these new materials that, if they are still working out what their end of life is, and perhaps they are biodegradable or compostable, but you need the systems in place and the facilities in place in order to be able to sort that those materials, either to get them back into a loop, or you need to be able to get them to a place where they can degrade. It's hugely cost prohibitive for yourself to even do those degradation tests. Like, is it biodegradable in the marine environment, in industrial composting? Like, there's so many barriers, and it's so expensive. I think there's also a part that's sort of like government and like legislation can play around helping to support what happens to the cycle of our materials, because it's often like you can produce the most incredible material, but maybe I heard Erin from Innovatives talk about the fact that sometimes the industrial composting sites sometimes don't know what to do with a mycelium material that can break down sort of in your garden in 30 days. So if it's fine, if it gets to landfill, it will break down, and that's great. But so that's nothing to do with the design of the material, like how it performs, what its end of life story can be, are fantastic, but we don't have the system in place in order to deal with it. So that's a bigger problem.
That's a really good point. And it was like at AlgaeNet, it was one of the things that we thought about a lot, is like, if a material requires human intervention to be broken down, to be recycled, chances are it won't happen, because it's like you've got economics at play. It's like there's so many factors, and it's like, so it's when I think about smart materials, this is what I think about. It's materials that can take responsibility for themselves.
I like that. That's excellent. And honestly, Erin and Amy, you both mentioned things that don't get covered enough. And I think next time we have this conversation, I'll just start off with, what do we not talk about enough in this space? Which is an excellent, is a really, really excellent points both of you bring up. Alex, I leave the closing thoughts to you in terms of, what you could answer either my question that I had posed, which is actually like, what is the drivers here? Or what do you think doesn't get talked enough about in this space, which might be, in fact, absolutely is a better question.
Oh, yeah, that is a good question. I hadn't prepared for that one. So.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We'll go back to like, who's driving this? Who's driving new materials going to market?
To be honest, I think Amy really kind of covered a lot of what I would say as well. It's coming from so many different angles. I think you can also look at it from a broader context. It's not just in fashion that we're seeing a kind of drive towards new materials and to understanding the kind of impact of what we do and sustainability. It's in almost every industry. I mean, we see that in any kind of new material, there's or new product, there's this kind of drive to have more recycled materials in it, or reduce the amount of packaging, reduce the amount of plastic. I guess actually your other question, what doesn't get talked about enough? I think the one area where we don't actually spend enough time is actually thinking through all of the consequences of some of the changes that we make. And this kind of fits into, is there the infrastructure to take on board these new materials, dispose of them? But it's also like the law of unintended consequence. So one example, I'll be honest, I don't know how 100% true this is, but one thing I had seen was McDonald's shifting from using plastic straws to paper straws. That on paper sounds like a great idea, less plastic, but they actually had a good recycling program in place for the plastic straws, and they went through so many and they could collect so many that they could actually deal with the end of life of that material. And suddenly all these paper straws, which had a different manufacturing, didn't last as long, less consumer satisfaction, actually in some ways had their own impact that was separate from what was actually a very noble intention. And I think this is a big issue in all sustainability, and it kind of fits into also avoiding greenwashing and just doing things that sound good on paper but don't actually have an impact. And then it becomes a broader context of how do we actually know what the impact is. So I'm going to finish that thought with LCAs. We just need to do lots more LCAs and make those LCAs really wide, and then we might have a little bit of an idea about which is the right way to go.
Alex, even if that was an apocryphal story, it was the perfect one for a session where we are talking about the life cycle of materials. So thank you. And I'd like to say thank you now to all of our panelists for taking time, whether it is late in the night, as it is for some, or just beginning the early evening. So thank you very much, Alex, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy, for taking time to share your thoughts and speak with us today.
Thank you. It was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
I also really enjoyed it. I've been looking forward to this because I know all three of you guys are it's like a AAA team here, and not just because everyone's name starts with A. And thank you, Erin, for sharing your time and your thoughts with us today.
Absolutely. Total pleasure.
All right, so for you in our audience, if you are interested in joining additional events with the IndieBio team, we have another conversation on food tech and planetary health this Thursday. Be sure to join. And otherwise, we will see you in the interweb ether, hopefully soon. Have a good night, everyone. I think I have to end. No, Josh, you have to. I think Josh has to end. Thanks, guys. That was really, really great. I really enjoyed it.